I'd like to introduce now our second and final speaker for today, Dr. Stephen Farrier, who will be talking about probably ethical issues and other challenges involved in doing good practice research. Stephen, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Morning, everyone. As is traditional, I shall share my screen to start with. Give me a shout if you can't see that or hear me. Morning, everyone. Thanks for the invitation here. I've been at a few of these sessions and found that there's something even not connected to my particular area from speakers, and I hope that's the same today. We're working in a similar context, particularly a similar kind of policy landscape, and we're committed to the Concordat. So there are ways in which maybe our works engage with ethics across. I'm mainly speaking, however, from the perspective of someone who works in performance and theatre, and that's where a lot of my experience lay. Here's an image on the right here of a bit of practice research from one of our researchers who was physically mapping identity. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. I'm going to start though by just describing myself for those of you who might want that. I'm a white cisgender-ish man. I'm wearing glasses, thick rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a blue and white striped shirt, and I'm speaking to you from my kitchen table in Brighton in the UK, which is just down on the south coast. I'm going to start really by talking about my roles, just to get a bit of context. That image on the right, on the left there, sorry, is of a piece of practice research. That's Dr. Laszlo Perlman there working on trans identity in performance there as a practice research. I chair the Research Ethics and Integrity Subcommittee at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama. I also chair the Ethics Committee of Conservatoires UK, or CUK as it's known, which is a gathering of 11 different conservatoires. And they come together for various things, particularly in terms of research and ethics. So I want to acknowledge my colleagues at Central and Conservatoires UK, where I did ask them to talk to me about emerging themes for them in ethics in their work, and particularly Dr. Joseph Parslow, who is a postdoctoral support for the ethics work that we do at Central and at CUK. I'm going to move on now to talk about the emerging themes and ethical considerations that we talk through in practice research. The image on the left there is of a performer laying on the laps of an audience during a piece of practice research. The audience seems to be enjoying it. We'll come back to talk a bit about audiences and consent. We thought we'd start with that image. What I want to do today is touch on the kinds of activity that might emerge around practice research and ethics, to think about the kinds of knowledge and how that engages with ethics, the kinds of audience and how that connects particularly to performance practices research, kinds of care, and kinds of ongoing concern. Think about kind here as being a bit flexible, the word kind. Think of it as both a kind of a movable classification, a kind of a thing, as well as paying mind to areas, a form of kindness, of thinking about it in those ones. But before we get to any of those kinds, I want to think a bit about practice research. On the left there is Dr. Farrokh Soltani, who is a practice researcher at Central, who is wearing some headphones, looking rather quizzically whilst listening. Farrokh works in radio drama, but also recorded media. So first off, though, I want to reflect actually a bit of what James was saying earlier about practice research. What is it? Often, as James was saying, there is a kind of question where people will want to articulate whether their work is practice research, what kind of practice research, under which we can think of practice-based research, practice as research, practice-informed research, creative research methods, other kinds of stuff. I too would think of practice research as an umbrella term for a number of different kinds of research engaging with practice, and tend not to get too hung up on that, although individual research projects may wish to articulate themselves in specific ways, because there are differences in approach in those things. But overarching, one thing that they might all share, and this is where we come in to think about the ethics, is that research requires the artist or the researcher's practice to produce its insights. So something has to be done, often in a studio, often with other people. And this brings about a particular range of challenges to ethics and their consideration. And so what I want to do really for the rest of the discussion is to talk through some emerging themes that I've come across in the two ethics committees, but also just in my general engagement with talking through ethics with researchers at the moment. So you can think about the kinds of activities. The image on the left there, that's Dr. Nando Messias and their work around femininity. We can see Nando sitting on a chair there with their legs crossed twice, around which there are some shoes. Nando's face is painted red. We can think that the artist is often the site of the research. Nando's research is the site of their research. And we can think about how this might negotiate with methodological issues, particularly things that are often valued by certain forms of research, critical distance being one of those. So we want to think about those in terms of research methodologies, but also as they engage with ethics. We want to think about, so I'm going to go back there, we're going to think about care and consent. These become really critical issues in practice research, particularly in the kind of work that Nando might produce. How researchers and artists, when they're the same person, often look after themselves, as well as any particular participants in the process. So where the making is artist focused, we might think that it still will rely on interaction with others, and often recording their responses. And we can think of that some classic or regular ethics processes might come in when you're collecting data from an audience. So most often in performance anyway, it's not a person working without others in a studio. Often an audience is required in a part of the process. So often the practice can form part of an iterative process. I can see how that might be different for different practices or different art forms that may not require an audience, but certainly the stuff that we're engaging with, often at Central and with CUK, engages with that kind of stuff. Another place that engages is with community. When we think about where the researcher might sit, there are some moments, for instance, where researchers might work with others to create work as part of their research. So I can think of a project, for instance, that recently has been happening at Central, where a researcher is working with unaccompanied migrant young people and making work with them. The work that they're making with the migrants isn't the research, rather the research is the research engaging with their facilitative processes. So where the activity sits and what counts as the practice sometimes need to be negotiated in the relationship to the ethics. And we can think of other forms of work where there's other ethical considerations that emerge. I can think here particularly of my experience of immersive work, immersive theatre, where one might enter into a space and be engaged already in a particularly immersive quality to a performance. And we can think about the audience-performer relationship as being one that's often built on inequality. The performer knows what's happening, the audience often don't. And this brings about considerations that maybe require ethical engagement with this kind of work. And we'll come on to talk a bit, I'll come on to talk a bit more about that as we move on. Can we move on to think about kinds of knowledges and that relationship to ethical research? On the left there is a person inside a giant puppet, skeletal puppet. That's a bit of research happening at Central there. So we can think of the kinds of knowledge that are produced and how they connect to other areas that actually James has mentioned some of, and then we'll come to talk maybe about the ethical questions related to that. The histories. Performance is often related to its histories and often wants to engage with those histories, often in embodied ways. But this brings about ethical questions about the processes of representation, particularly as an ethical gesture in a piece of work. So often histories around performance processes, the making of performance, are opaque. Often more, people articulate it as a magic or the X factor. They're often opaque in that sense. And that doesn't sit very well with ethical transparency. So engaging with that process ethically becomes an important part of the discussions we would have with researchers. We understand that the knowledge, as James was saying, is tacit, it's personal, and it's embodied. And so this brings about some ethical considerations, often through doing. Often the doing of the research brings into the room the kinds of question that becomes the research issue. I'm thinking here of Hannah Ballou's work, for instance, on objectification and comedy, stand-up comedy, and a moment at which she asks the audience to objectify in a certain kind of way, and the audience is put into this kind of ethical dilemma about objectification, all whilst having a good time. So the personal becomes enwrapped, right, in an important source of understanding, often based in identity, particularly the works that I interact with. So Nando's work we saw earlier, for instance, a lot of that work stems from an experience that they had of transphobic violence in the street. And from that, this practiced research emerged. So we have to think about that as an ethical engagement with the work. Thinking about the reading and the framework, and this relates a bit to what you're saying, James. We can think about what work might be shared and used by others. Particularly, this is a key ethical drive for many researchers and about integrity. So often practice, in my experience of engaging with it, often the practice engages as part of a process that ends with a piece of work, but also ends with a framework or a reading practice or an approach that can be shared with others who too might be able to follow that framework or practice or approach, but necessarily will produce different forms of results or other knowledges from it. So the replicability is an interesting question in these kinds of works. And often the work is audience orientated. Practice is often practice research is often audience orientated. And it does focus on the audience form a relationship often. And what the audience see and understand and feel in the work become an important part of the ethical engagement. So let's move on to just think about audiences, the kinds of audiences. There's an image there of a person on the left, who is in a piece of work. That's one of our researchers at Central, who's currently working on gender and blindness and audio description. So the kind of audience, we can think about the audience as participants. So as we know that what the audience see, think, feel, become really important, particularly as forms of feedback to the researchers. So I would say even in the most normative kinds of work, someone's made a piece, they're showing it to an audience, they're asking what the audience feels, that the audience's presence in that sense shift the research. And the audience then are participants, and they witness the work and reflect on it. So therefore we need to think about informed consent, where people might come and witness a piece of work and reflect on it. That's data gathering that requires an ethical consideration. And we can think about this as immersive work, for instance, as I mentioned earlier, the kinds of audience for that. How we do that with transparency, it can be a challenge for the kind of work. The content of the work too is something that we engage with quite a lot. So the way that the work progresses with its content is something that we need to engage with ethically, often in formal ways through ethics applications, more of which later. But I think of it this way, and this chimes a bit actually again with something that James was saying. I might go to a theatre and see a confrontational work as part of my leisure time, but the same content in a research context requires a different kind of consent, often related to transparency and articulating that, and care and carefulness with audiences. So we think then in relation to particularly to the kinds of audiences, like who are they? If we think of the ethical principle of justice in research, we think of getting an even spread of research participants, particularly paying in mind the relationship it has to equality, diversity, inclusion. And we can question actually who are the audience and how that folds into things that we might draw from them. I'm aware, for instance, that we have a yearly practice research festival at Central that draws other practice researchers and academics and people who go to theatre festivals. And so when we ask their opinion of something, we get that's the kind of report that's the kind of data we get back. And so that needs folding into any findings that we might wish to draw out, which might be different if we did the work in other places. And definitely some do make an effort to do that. I'm thinking of a colleague who works in queer performance, who made a piece of work that its first iteration was in a community centre rather than on a main stage. It moved to a main stage, but the work in the community centre became very important. And care then is another critical aspect of the processes of ethics in practice research. We think about in this case, the care for the audience is to include them in informed consent. And this informed consent might go beyond content warnings, but engaging with caringness and actual practical things like who to go to, what kinds of questions, leaving opportunities for people to disengage, those kinds of things. And this might be stitched often into the form of the work. So I think about works that I've seen absolutely give the opportunity for people to not engage or to refuse to engage or to leave in a way that's very comfortable. So I'm going to move on to care. Think about kinds of care. On the left there is one of our researchers, Dr. Simon Dodie, who's working on campness and identity. And here we see someone in a suit who's lit really from the shoulders to the knees, so we can't see the rest of their body. And this particular project's working on inherited camp gestural codes. So the kinds of care that we might think about care in the process. So I think about these as key care moments. When we're talking about ethics, we often are coming back to thinking about care and carefulness. So particularly when we're talking about this, when I'm training people or engaging with their projects, I think about key care moments to cement ethical conduct. And we'll come back to the word conduct in a second. Key care moments are as much about looking after the audience as it is about the researcher, as I said earlier. Often in ethics applications, we've noted that researchers often don't consider their own care. And in work like Nando's earlier, that was engaged with violence, that this becomes a very important part of generating the kinds of knowledges that it does. So there are key care moments, looking after your participants, looking after yourself, and doing that transparently. So we think about the self and how that might be structured into processes and methodologies. So we can think of this perhaps in a broader sense in terms of integrity, that this might be stitched into the activity of the work and the processes through which it's traveling. And that it contributes to the knowledge of the research itself. And we understand that, for instance, that we've all felt this when we've been to see a piece of performance, that researchers might endure positive and negative sensations along with audiences as part of the processes. So we need to be aware that difficulties might arise and how that impacts the sense of what is being produced. So we can think then, we can move this onto a broader sense. We can think about the area. often research is something, practice research in this area is often something that wants to address something that's been, doesn't seem as, has been unequal in a particular performance form, particularly related to equity and inclusion. And so sometimes the areas come to engage with that in a particular kind of way, that there is an ethical response to something that's reproduced in the area. And so careful also to understand that the subjects in the area have a particular tradition that one might need to engage with carefully in order then to transform it or to change it or to question it. We tend to think about things as principles, practices and behavior. This is how we articulate ethical conduct, particularly when I'm doing training. So we tend to think of them as not only as part of integrity, we emphasize ethics as as things we do consistently. Now we think about principles, so we describe the Concordat for research integrity, the Nolan principles, engaging with specific institution principles. The practices then, we expect to see ethical clearance, not only embodied in, so as a practice of ethical clearance, but also that process for us is discursive and about the quality and the integrity of the work. So when we're talking, so before a researcher might submit an ethics application, we're often engaged in dialogue about it as a way of thinking about the quality of the work. And I suppose we think about behaviours then as not only as about making sure that you have gone through all the processes through which you need to travel, but these were also micro behaviours that engage at a level of the research practice relating to truthfulness, transparency, openness. So these are behaviours that we can think about engaging with in the studio. So we can think about I'm coming to an end now, nearly, the kinds of ongoing concerns. So these are kind of things that have emerged, and now these are things, themes, and these are ongoing. On the left there is a picture of some masks hanging in the studio. Some of them are, there are faces, quite distorted faces. Informed consent and plain language is a consistent thing to which we return. We think of this as care and carefulness, and we also engage with informed consent, particularly with CUK colleagues. We've been talking quite a lot about not only consent, but assent. So the continued monitoring of the researcher that people want to be engaged with the work, and that consent can be given in many different ways. The reputation of ethics processes often, particularly with new researchers, often can result in a kind of ethics freeze. I can't do anything. I'm exploiting everyone. I can't do anything. So the way that we try to kind of thaw that freeze is to think about ethics discursively and usefully structure the institutional's ethics processes usefully. So for instance, at Central, we have two processes through which ethics can flow. One is low risk and often a bit more rapid for work that apparently feels unproblematic, so we would still engage with that. And then one that's a bit longer that then goes through our systems and out into the CUK externality. But those processes are for different kinds of projects. Often when we're talking about ethics, often when I'm talking about ethics, particularly with PhD researchers, tensions might emerge between the quality of the work and the ethics requirement of transparency. And we can see in some work that this might have an impact on how we might manage this. And that need not do this, but one of the things that we tend to talk with people around is that we will say that the research question is the driver for what's produced. If that means that an artist might produce something that's less engaged with, it has a different quality than they normally would engage with, that has to allow to happen unless that's part of the research question. So the artistic quality is about how do I deal with transparency when the piece of work I'm making needs to engage with lying to my audience, which lots of theatre does. And the transparency of the process. So this relates actually to the fear sometimes that ethics brings about in researchers, practice researchers. We expect, one of the things that I was very struck by when I first started to work in this area is that we expect researchers to be transparent about what they're doing, but often ethics processes aren't transparent. So at Central, we developed a very clear workflow diagram that shows researchers what happens when they submit their ethics application, where it goes to, who's likely to be looking at it, what happens, what kind of feedback might they get. So transparency of the process, I think, is something that is an ongoing concern. Okay, conclusions. Here we have an image on the left there. It's returning to Dr. Laszlo Perlman there, who's just about to do a handstand as the end. So we can think about emergent themes. One thing we return to constantly is principles, and that they're the same for all research. We return to them all the time. Beneficence and equity and justice are key ones that we return through CUK and through Central. We can think about them as often practice research, and I think James mentioned this, relates to bespoke methodologies or bespoke ideas of how we might have to engage with the ethics of a piece of work. Often it does relate to extant and known methodologies, but sometimes not at all. And we can think about the structural resistances to ethics. This might be, as I described earlier, a lack of transparency around the ethics process, but we also note that we are working in a social context that's riven with inequalities, and sometimes we want to disentangle how and if the practice, the research, replicates some of the same difficulties. Well, I know in my own research area, asking someone their gender is a very difficult question. It's not an easy thing to do. And we can think about how we set up our processes to engage with that. I suppose I want to finish on the last point, which is the artist in the research counts. The who is doing the research can be very important to the kinds of material that might be produced. In some sense, this classically might be about access, but more often than not, it's about how an artist or a researcher might engage with the variety of the forms of consent that might be required for different forms of research and artistic practice. I'm going to stop there. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Stephen, thank you so much. That was fascinating. We've already had a number of questions come in response to your very insightful talk. We have one of our attendees from the University of Lancaster says, I'm doing a practice-based PhD in film. How can I care for audiences within film? Or does care for audiences really only apply to theatre? And they note that when the film is out, they have no control over who watches it. And also their research doesn't include the audience response, only the process of creating the film.
It's, I would say that it would be different at different stages. So if the process does require audience response, then you would need to care for them. But of course, once the work is out, the work is out. It's not unlike any other piece of research that when it's in the world, it's in the world. I suppose disclaimers might be about care, but of course, film will engage with representational practices, which itself are ethical and do require care. So I suppose that's not a very full answer, but that would be my initial impulse, would be that, of course, once the work is out there, but how the work is framed might also engage with care and carefulness, but actually the content of the work too can do that as well.
Thank you, that's really helpful. John Dean asks, if the practice is performance and the spectator experience is predicated on a clean and unconditioned viewing, how can we best manage ethical consent in advance?
Well, this again is interesting. I think that there's a number of things that you can do with that. One is that the audience understand what they're going to see, and that there's some transparency there. That classically, like with interview, you could stop at any point, you can leave at any point. That you have some agency, that the audience have some agency, that it's very clear that at any point that they can leave without ruining the research, and that's something. So the right to withdraw is pretty critical there. But also, depending on what the content of the practice is, also forms of support and care after the experience. So if someone's experiencing, I can see this in lots of like one-on-one performance practice. People might take a while to process that. When that's a performance practice, where you might just go and see that, and in a local theatre space, the processes for that might happen. With you, the debrief might happen afterwards with other people who might have experienced that. With research, I think that that ethically we should be supporting how people might be processing that and how they might be engaging with some of the emotions that they might bring up.
Thank you, it's very helpful. A follow-up question for me. In some research disciplines, there can be forms of covert research where consent is sought after the fact, for example. Is that ever sort of applicable in the sort of performance space when you want to sort of, as John says, a kind of clean and unconditioned viewing, or is that not a model that works or is appropriate for these kinds of practice, research and ethical concerns thereof?
It's interesting because there has been, I'm thinking about a particular project that did engage with that, but it wasn't it was people in the street. So it wasn't engaging necessarily with a particular framing. I'd have to think about that a bit more. I don't know what a clean and unconditioned positionality might be. If I'm seeing a piece of work, to what extent is my experience of seeing practice research before already informing my reading or experience of that is a bit of a question there. But I suppose legitimately, where we have come across this, I think we've had a requirement where actually researchers do need to engage audiences with that this is a piece of research. You don't necessarily have to lay out what's going to happen specifically, but alongside that, you can also say, well, you can withdraw or you can stop at any point. You don't have to worry about that. But I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen. But at the end, we'll debrief. That would seem like a reasonable approach.
Thank you, it's really helpful. A couple of questions about ethics and consent. An attendee agrees that you're right, ethics can be seen as a barrier to the research and that the way to go is a more discursive and transparent process. What can be done to ensure that ethics is appropriate to the type of research being conducted?
I think that this is a critical question, actually, because I think that the regular forms of research, of consent, actually, in practice research, often some communities won't engage with it at all. And I think that actually ethics committees particularly need to also engage with a broader range of how they engage, how they accept from a researcher that they're getting informed consent. So I know, for instance, of projects where people might be working with migrant domestic workers who genuinely are not going to sign a consent form. That's not part of what they do, but there is a way in which the researcher we can engage with the researcher to engage with consent with that person. We can record it in other ways, or we can record that the researcher has got that. So there needs to be trust, ethical, there needs to be trust at some level. I can think too of other communities of a project of where someone was working with the specific communities who absolutely would not sign anything because they had signed some things in their historical past that had ended hadn't ended very well for them, so they wouldn't sign anything. And the way that you entered into this particular community was through a family member, so through access. That was a process of consent. This researcher had quite a difficult time convincing their ethics committee that would seem as legitimate, and that they would withdraw if they felt at any point that the consent was being withdrawn. So, agreed. It can be difficult, but transparency, I think, has to be at all times has to be a kind of driving principle.
That's really interesting, Stephen. Thank you. I can see some parallels with other research disciplines and other types of research where dealing with participant groups who, for very valid reasons, don't want to go down the traditional route of I have a consent form and I will sign it. Thank you. That's fascinating. Sticking with, you've also, I think, already answered a couple of follow-up questions which were asking about forms of consent. sticking to the practicalities of ethics here, do ethics application, typical ethics application forms kind of work for this type of research, or do they need to be modified as well to better capture to better allow the expression of the ethical challenges and the proposed methods for overcoming them?
We would have, interestingly, we tend to use, at Central, we've got two processes, and they do ask similar questions. And they do ask quite traditional questions, but they also leave space for narrative around anything that actually is an ethical issue that isn't stimulated by the series of questions. We think the series of questions there are really to focus researchers on what they're doing and, oh, am I really engaging with a vulnerable adult, or am I really engaging with somebody who isn't, and how they might support anything that might emerge, those kinds of things. I know that the CUK processes has specific forms that aimed at specific kinds of research. So practice research has a different kind of form than, say, questionnaire research. However, at Central we use the same form. So in terms of just like doing it, but often the low risk ethics applications often are turned around much more quickly. So we circulate that amongst members of the committee or researchers who might have some understanding of the particular context of the work, who's not connected to the researcher. And so often we can turn them around pretty quickly. So it won't just be about the form, it will be about the kind of back-end processes that might engage, so that you don't have to do your ethics 6 months before you've got access to a community that's only going to be there for 2 weeks, that you only know about. So we can turn things around pretty rapidly in that sense.
Thank you. Actually, there's some themes there that go on to the next question. Gail said she'd be interested to hear more about informed consent and transparency for research participants, where the artistic outputs may change and evolve throughout the life of a project, or where those outputs may be co-created with the participants.
This is really interesting, because co-creation does form a big part of lots of practice research, particularly if you're doing it in communities, that kind of stuff. It is about consent. I think that also there are other ethical principles about acknowledging people who have worked with you, making sure that due credit is given, those kinds of things, I would say. I suppose also in relation to thinking about co-creation and informed consent, particularly as things evolve, is this concept of assent, which is, are the indicators telling you that this person is still happy to be part of this project? And we can think of this particularly in projects where there are vulnerable adults or children who can't necessarily give their own consent. So parents or guardians might give consent, or carers. But if the participant gets distressed, you can see that they're telling you they don't want to be part of that conversation right now. So that might be a way. But also, it would be about that transparency maybe just needs to punctuate the process. And so you might have moments where through the process where you might check in to think about consent. Are we still all right to do this? Can we still carry on? Here's where we're going. Any questions? Do you want to withdraw? Those kinds of things might just become regular moments through a process. You're muted, James.
I know we do that once a webinar and that happens. Now, okay, talk about the process still. James earlier mentioned how a piece of practice could evolve into practice research, and that's obviously a somewhat different start to a research project than more, I mean, we can use the term traditional here, or more frequent, where there's a definitive start point to a research project, though I appreciate in some disciplines like the arts and humanities, the start point can be less clear and precise than, say, in some fields of STEM research. Now, institutions generally aren't set up for someone saying, I've kind of already started this, and I want to make sure it's ethical and has all the approvals. And there can often be an institutional policy of not allowing anything kind of retrospective permissions or review. How, specifically for practice research, how can institutions and researchers make sure that valid research projects that evolve out of practice meet all the required standards and aren't, but equally aren't sort of said, well, actually, no, you just can't do that because you need to say it's research right from the beginning?
I think that it's interesting. There's a couple of things here. One is that we've been wrestling somewhat with this. I think that one thing we generally speaking on both the committees that I work on, we wouldn't give retrospective um, uh, clearance, particularly where consent had not been sought from any participant. So that, I think, would be a line over which we couldn't necessarily tread. That's not to say that you couldn't re-ask those participants to reflect on a process, and that's where your research might start. In terms of how because of course there is, as James said, there is just practice, and that's okay. And there are research elements in practice. I suppose that what we would want to see articulated is the practice research is driven by a particular research question, which might evolve out of other practice. But once you formed your question, from then on in would be your practice research. So it wouldn't be disconnected. And likewise, you might think about, well, this might be think of it as a kind of pilot that gave rise to a specific question, but here's the point at which then I'm going to engage with the ethics. So retrospective clearance isn't something that's generally given, but we would expect, I would say, in the culture of the school, that ethical conduct, it forms part of practice too. So we not only have ethics frameworks for research, but also for the general business of a day-to-day academic institution. So we would expect some of these to form part of what's already generated. So retrospective, I would say rarely has that happened, but practice research can be articulated actually later on as, that's how it felt. But right now, in terms of ethical clearance, generally speaking, committees are not inclined to do that.
Thank you, Stephen. I think we've time for maybe two more quick questions. Firstly, David says, do you think for practice research there's a problem with research ethics processes and procedures that have their roots in STEM research? And, would it be better to adopt perhaps a virtue-based approach to ethics for practice research? And the other question was, do you have any thoughts about ethical issues involved in the use of animals in practice research, particularly with theatre and performance work?
Yeah, I'll take the first one first because that's a bit easier. I think that certainly some of those systems I don't work in a multi-faculty, so my experience will be limited to what I can see and what I've talked to with other people. But generally speaking, I would say that yes, there are problems with the expectation of, particularly where stuff goes through a kind of broader committee from a multi-faculty. I can think of an instance, for instance, where a researcher was working with a creative project around HIV positive people. They too were an HIV positive person. That's what gave them access to that particular community. The feedback they got from their ethics committee was very focused on taking care for these HIV positive people, which is right. But that committee had entirely cut out the fact that the research themselves was also part of that community. So I think that their processes, for whatever their standards then of taking care of patients, which is how they were articulated, rather than participants in a project, I think is something that probably does need engaging with. I know I've spoken to other colleagues in multi-faculties, and they do have some of them do have committees that might be connected to specific schools, but often art schools are wrapped into a kind of broader school. And so still there would need to be a particular other approach. So yes.
Thank you. And as a final question, any experience of ethical issues involving the use of animals in practice research, particularly theatre and performance work?
I can only think of one instance where a researcher, this was actually an MA researcher who was doing some work with worms. There is some guidance out for best practice with animals. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can find the link. And our ethics forms indicates a researcher out to best practice with animals. Our question really would come back to the principles of care, particularly with care, and how we might engage with it depends on what the specific process will be. There certainly are controversial works where the animals are engaged with, but they're kind of performances rather than research. So there is guidance out around that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I think we'll close the session there. So Stephen, that was fascinating, and thank you very much for your informative answers to all the interesting questions that came in. Now, I've had lots of fascinating questions today, and I appreciate the time to deal with them all, but we'll see how we can flow those up. And we've already said to our speakers that UKRA as a charity wants to do more in the practice research space, and there are lots of fascinating issues. And we recognise that this is an area which is perhaps somewhat underserved in terms of research integrity support compared to some other methods of research. So, we're a small charity. We want to see what we can do on these issues. So I'd like to close by firstly thanking our speakers today, Stephen and James, for two fascinating and really informative presentations. Thank you both very much for your time today, your talks, and for sharing your thoughts in the Q&A sessions afterwards. Now, we have a couple of other events coming up I'd just like to quickly let you know about. We have our next webinar will be on equality, diversity, inclusion and research and its implications in good research practice, and that will be happening in April. As with all our webinars, it's free to attend and the booking link will be circulated shortly. We're continuing to do virtual roundtables for UKRA subscriber institutions. And if you haven't had an invitation to one of those recently, you will get one soon. And finally, for all of you, whether you subscribe to UKRA or not, a date for your diary, the 25th and 26th of May will be our annual conference. And like the webinars, it will be a free virtual event open to all. So we do hope we can see you there. Finally, a bit of a shameless piece of advertising. UKREO is a small charity. We do a lot of work and we're supported in that by a lot of committed volunteers. So if discussions today have piqued your interest in issues of ethics and integrity and good practice, whether in practice research or elsewhere, and you'd like to do more on these issues, do consider getting in touch. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you very much to all of you who came along today. The audience, you've been utterly fabulous, and your questions have made this a really dynamic and interesting event. Thank you again to our two speakers, James and Stephen. We hope to see you again in April. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Thank you very much.